Do what thou will be the whole piece of law.
Oh, you're finally awake. I was hoping you'd wake up soon. After all, viewer, you've come at quite a unique time. You may see that I have strapped your arms and legs to this chair with a very weird button in my hand, but I have given you a very unique experience. We are right now sitting in a top secret nuclear-proof bunker, and I'm going to give you a very unique decision where you can either choose to press this button yourself. I will move it over to your hand and you can press it, or I will gladly just give up this whole charade and I'll probably go outside of this bunker to be arrested. So I need to ask you one question. Do you fear the power of the nuclear warhead? If you do, you'll tell me to go outside. But if you really want to prove yourself that you're a true believer that nothing will happen, I encourage you, press this button. Consider all the evidence. Fission is impossible. The atom structures, we know it is fake. That one aviator guy saying that the damage done was like any other bomb. You obviously fear a bomb, right? But it obviously won't end the world if one goes off. So why not give it an experiment and test your theory now? I hope you'll forgive me for keeping you in that chair the entirety of this exercise, I will say. But since I have this opportunity, a captive audience, you might say, I'm going to lay one ground rule. Since we are obeying the rules of facts and logic, I want to set down my favorite razor from the past. You know what razors are, right? Those thought experiments where if this is true, then that is also true. The most popular one, never attribute to malice what you can attribute to stupidity. Those are razors. And the razor that I am going to apply today, very artfully, is one called Hitchens' razor. This is done by every atheist's favorite, Christopher Hitchens, in which he asserts, which can be asserted without evidence, can also be dismissed without evidence. Now, this is going to be the key in what we are doing today, because I know you might be inclined to press this, but this presentation is to explain why I should just go outside and not beat the Fed allegations. Not that I was aiming to disprove them in the first place, but I'm not going to be giving anyone reasons to disprove them in this video. If you, for some reason, are this guy yells at David Koresh using FBI-approved sources, you're not gonna like this video, and I'm completely okay with that, because I'll be right. Now, what are we even going to be discussing? Because I have obviously just chained you to this chair and given you nothing of substance. Well, I got from one of my famous hacker friends, I got some whisperings from this friend about it originally, to which I paid it no mind. Then when I had actually started this creative endeavor, I went back and looked at it, and I found that this rabbit hole was a lot deeper, and people were a lot more invested than I had given them credit for. So I have stripped a post that not even the threads that wanted them would take, and I'm going to rip it apart piece by piece, because that's what facts and logic does.
And facts don't care about your feelings.
It doesn't care about how you feel about this. I'm going to give you some good reasons why we should just be done with this whole thing, and you should never question it again. Just kidding. The entire thing about facts and logic is you can do your own research, and it will always come up in your favor if you are being completely objective with no emotional investment, which is what we are attempting to do. Now, this article starts with one thing. Savatsky. No, it starts with an article sourced from the New York Times. Now, the New York Times is cited a lot in here, and I'm getting it through what I can obtain without paying, because this bunker cost a lot of money, the flat screen that you're looking at cost a lot of money, and of course I couldn't get you in here so securely without spending a lot of money, so I have no money left for New York Times subscriptions. So anything that I can get is going to be used, even though it costs $1. I'm down to my last penny right now. The poster, who I'm going to call Arc of the Cube, or just Cube for short, because that's who posted it, links to a source called Seversky Limits Atom Bomb Power. Now, this is a New York Times article from November 3rd, 1945. After Seversky, who we will talk about more in a second, tours the bomb site of Hiroshima. And the way Cube frames it is he wants you to believe that this is Seversky debunking the atom bomb myth. So, if you want the devil on your shoulders as to why you should press this button, I'm going to let Cube be that devil. I'm going to be the angel that says you really should listen to why you shouldn't, and we should just end this whole charade. But if you're insistent on proving yourself, I will give you some good reasons. Now, what does Seversky's account say? Quoting from this post, because I can't actually access the article, I'm just going to review the quote that Cube has posted. Seversky proceeds, quote, "In Hiroshima, I was prepared for radically different sights, but to my surprise, Hiroshima looked exactly like all the other burned out cities in Japan. There was a familiar pink blot about 2 miles in diameter. It was dotted with charred trees and telephone poles. Only one of the city's 20 bridges was down. Hiroshima's clusters of modern buildings in the downtown section stood upright," unquote. Now, one of the initial points that people like Cube would have you believe is that the evidence of these concrete buildings standing is concrete proof that the official narrative is false. Now, let me give you a rationale as to why the official narrative might be true. Japan had a massive earthquake, sometimes called the Great Kanto Earthquake, in 1923. It was a magnitude 7.9 earthquake, and it destroyed a massive amount of buildings and removed hundreds of people from the Japanese census. About 140,000 of them. Now, why is this important? Because unlike a lot of people in this story, the Japanese will learn from their mistakes and institute the Building Standards Act in 1923, the same year that the earthquake happened. And this act, most importantly for us, I assume you don't care about the rest of Japanese zoning codes and building requirements, is that these buildings should be built to withstand even the most intense earthquake events, because Japan gets a lot of these. It makes sense that after this one, it would be the straw that broke the camel's back for them to start building these buildings. Now, what do earthquakes and bombs have in common, I hear you asking? Well, earthquakes and bombs both produce a large amount of physical disruption. This physical disruption from a bomb is it hitting the side of the building and exploding, creating a large amount of pressure released at a single time. Earthquakes are physical disruption in the sense of it shakes the building and attempts to use momentum and lack of secure structure to shake the building down. Both of these are physical forces. None of these are chemical. Chemical would be a different story. But I think it's fair to interpolate that buildings built to resist earthquakes, physical force, and buildings built to resist bombs, also physical force, are closer than you might think. And to repeat, these buildings were not untouched. It's just that these buildings are intact at all, which people like Cube would say this is evidence of the traditional firebombing method. Now, I'm going to be using that term a lot, and let me explain what that is. Now, in the Second World War, U.S. Air Marshal Curtis LeMay saw that traditional bombs were not working very well in Japan, and he made the choice one time to switch to incendiaries and see what happens. Now, this set the tone for the rest of the Pacific bombing campaign, because due to Japan's mostly wooden structures, as admitted by Cube himself, were very susceptible to fire, and their concrete buildings are not susceptible to fire, because as you may know, concrete doesn't burn. So, these concrete buildings surviving would be evidence that the traditional firebombing method was used and not anything greater. Now let's continue with the Seversky quote. I understand this may not be enough to convince you. This is more of a, I'll ask you at the end. So, keep questioning everything. That's the most important thing. Never let your feelings rule over the facts. Let's get to that second part of the Seversky quote. At the T-bridge, the aiming point for the atom bomb, I looked for the bald spot where everything presumably had been vaporized in the twinkling of an eye. It wasn't there or anything else. I could find no traces of unusual phenomena, unquote. Now, this is traditionally used as a smoking gun by people like Cube. However, I would like to provide some background context, because in a vacuum, excised and cherry-picked from everything else, even though it's in the context of this quote, it's excised from the historical context of who Seversky was and when this was written. Now, as I've previously mentioned, this article was written November 3rd, 1945, and published to the New York Times after Seversky toured the bomb site at Hiroshima. However, I would read it more as Seversky was expecting something a little more grand, because as people like Cube will mention, and I think it's very important, the impact of nuclear weapons had to be propagandized. It had to be increased. People were asked to lie about the bomb's capabilities, and I think that is partially why this theory even exists at all. Now, this is my interpolation, I can't speak for Cube himself, but the way he assumes things is from that propagandistic view. A nuke goes off, boom, everything around it is instantly turned to dust and vaporized in front of everything, which is simply not true. And I feel that Seversky fell for this propaganda as much as Cube did, because when Truman is giving off quotes such as, "That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It had more than 2,000 times the blast power of a British Grand Slam, which is the largest bomb ever yet used in the history of warfare. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. And we have spent $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history and won." Those, by the way, all come from Truman's speech when he announced that the nuclear bomb had been used. Seversky must have been disappointed because Cube neglects to mention the fact that Seversky did a follow-up interview with Time magazine, also airing his grievances and disappointment. Apparently, Seversky was just a big fan of Time as a whole when it came to his publishing agencies. But the interview in full goes as such. Quote, "From the one-legged Russian-born Alexander de Seversky, the man who wrote Victory Through Air Power, came a declaration intended to be heartening. The atomic bomb is just another bomb. After surveying Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the self-chosen priest of omnipotent air power told U.S. newsmen in Tokyo, quote, much of the effects of the atomic bombs in Japan was due to flimsy construction. In a steel and concrete U.S. city, one of the bombs would have done no more damage than a 10-ton TNT bomb," unquote. Also quoted, quote, "The bomb was a great step, but only a step in the, quote, science of demolition, unquote, unquote." Another one, quoting as such, quote, "200 superforts with old-style bombs could do as much damage as the atomic bombs have done in Japan," unquote. De Seversky's conclusion was the same one he had reached in every other strategic argument. Air power is the answer. Of course, De Seversky admitted, we cannot judge what the future will bring. There may come a time when we can deliver atomic bombs without the use of planes, but under the present setup, we must have control of the air, unquote, unquote. Now, this article was written on November 12th, 1945, after he had had more time to process the outcome of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He is also not a disinterested party, as some people like Cube would have you believe. For someone who rails so much against propaganda and industry insiders for sources, Seversky is nothing of the sort. Seversky wrote a book called Victory Through Air Power in 1942. This book was referenced by many U.S. officials, including Truman himself, and he favored a strategic destruction and overwhelming air power style approach. Now, everyone after the war had a vested interest in keeping themselves, quote-unquote, alive. Now, Seversky would have been advocating at this time for an independent strategic air command, aka what we know now as the U.S. Air Force. Seversky would also be trying to keep the budget, because at this time, Truman was looking to cut military budgets by about 70%. Now, the Navy had the most pronounced effect, having one of the only quote-unquote revolts in its entire history of the service, but also people were making good arguments as to why everything else should go and why they should stay. The Air Force had the strongest because they could deliver the atomic bombs, but the rest of them had to make better arguments as to why they were required in this new dawning nuclear age, if you believe the official narrative, which is supported by numerous historical sources. However, as he mentioned himself, this is not a denial. He's not saying, oh, nukes don't exist. He's saying that this bomb did not live up to the hype that he was sold on. Remember, he said himself, it is a great step, but only a step in the science of demolition. He is not denying the bomb's existence. He is merely upset that it was not as cool as he thought it would be. Being such a big air power advocate, I'm sure he would endorse the usage of it further, because the argument of the bomb being just another bomb was a good justifier as to why we should produce more and continue to use them in war and not stigmatize them as something special, but that's far beyond the scope of what I want to prove. Now, with that context, let's continue to the next part of the quote that Cube provides. Quote, "What I did see was in substance a replica of Yokohama or Osaka or the Tokyo suburbs, the familiar residue of an area of wood and brick houses razed by uncontrollable fire. Everywhere I saw the trunks of charred and leafless trees, burned and unburned chunks of wood. The fire had been intense enough to bend and twist steel girders and to melt glass until it ran like lava, just as in other Japanese cities. The concrete buildings nearest to the center of the explosion, some only a few blocks from the heart of the atom blast, showed no structural damage. Even cornices, canopies, and delicate exterior decorations were intact. Window glass was shattered, of course, but single panel frames held firm. Only windows of 2 or more panels were bent and buckled. The blast impact, therefore, could not have been unusual." Unquote. Now, I want to leave this burned thing for, let's say, the ultimate moment, but in Seversky's own interpretation of how we can look back on him, this tracks with his disappointment. In fact, I would say that these points of context saying window glass was shattered but single panel frames held firm, even these delicate things were intact, even bolsters his opinion, as only one bomb would have been dropped that day. It's not as if the fire ignores the delicate. It's not as if fire ignores any of these concrete buildings, as well as these delicate things remaining intact, as I'll explain later, are evidence that only one blast occurred and that it was far less than people had predicted. But, in my effort to be thorough, Cube brings up what Cube calls a study that was just never published for some reason. Now, this study, I'm going to call it that for now, was published on August 1st, 1990. Now, I'm going to read you the Times article that Cube cites, because of course it's a New York Times article and I managed to get this one for free because it was available without having to pay for the archive. I don't know how. But it goes as such, quote, "A 40-year study of thousands of Japanese who survived the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki shows radiation exposure did not cause genetic damage that could lead to human mutations," a researcher said today. The researcher, John Boyce of the National Cancer Institute, said, quote, "Ionizing radiation is known to cause heritable mutations in many species of plants and animals, but intense study of 70,000 offspring of atomic bomb survivors has failed to identify an increase in congenial abnormalities, cancer, chromosome aberrations, or mutational blood protein changes," unquote. Mr. Boyce's comments were published in the current issue of the Journal of American Medical Association, which carried several studies on the 45th anniversary of the bombings. Since 1950, 100,000 survivors of the 2 blasts have been studied. Mr. Boyce said that the primary health problems faced by the survivors has been cancer. Those who were young children at the time also suffered impaired growth, unquote. Now, that's the New York Times article, but I want to establish the broader context of what Cube is trying to prove with this study, because Cube then continues in the next part to say, oh, I visited Fukushima and Hiroshima myself with a Geiger counter to go check for radiation. So this is meant to reinforce, I am interpolating, that radiation is either exaggerated, 1, or 2, flat out does not exist, because Cube himself will go to say that I found no radiation at Hiroshima or Nagasaki, which I will explain in a second. But I went and found the actual study. But the fact that Cube calls it a study is misinformed, because in the Journal of the American Medical Association, it is listed as an editorial written by John Boyce. Now, what's the difference between an editorial and a study? An editorial is either an opinion piece or an agglomeration of studies done. Now, he specifically says in this editorial that, quote, "These studies have provided the framework for understanding the biological effects of radiation," unquote. This is a combined editorial opinion of 3 studies taken from issues of the journal from Yoshimoto, Yamakaze, and Schul. He goes on to disprove Cube's point almost directly after the listed New York Times quote, as in the following paragraph, after saying that they cause no heritable mutations, continues in the literal next paragraph to say, quote, "Continued follow-up of the Japanese survivors has changed the emphasis of concern from genetic to somatic effects. The primary late effects have been cancer, persistent chromosomal aberrations in circulating lymphocytes, aka red blood cells, and lenticular opacities. Young children who were exposed to atomic bomb radiation also experienced impaired growth. However, mortality due to diseases other than cancer has not been conclusively linked to radiation, nor has there been any evidence of aging and life shortening. Also, Boyce, continuing his limitation analysis of this editorial, states further, quote, follow-up of the survivors who were exposed in utero, however, suggests that they may be at an increased risk of cancer in adult life, since newborns treated with radiation are known to be at an elevated risk of developing cancers in adulthood. It should come as no surprise that exposures of just a few months before birth would also carry some risk. Now, I feel this proves conclusively that radiation, first of all, exists, and second of all, has health effects. Because just the fact that it doesn't concern one specific aspect that they were concerned about over 70 years ago does not mean that that's the case forever. He says in the study that the concern has switched from genetic to somatic effects, aka what actually happens to people exposed to radiation. And the proof of those effects is overwhelming. You can look anywhere in the survivors' accounts, in multiple stories of people being exposed to radiation in many sorts of different nuclear accidents, as well as just this editorial itself, or the studies that were taken from the journal, which I also looked into, and they're horrible. But just to sum up this entire editorial, and why I think listing it, Cube basically shoots himself in the foot, is because it comes to the completely opposite conclusion of what he wants you to believe if you go and find the actual study. At a point in this document, he says that I have done intensive research, which just seems to be an exercise in confirmation bias. But let's not well poison so hard that I can't claim that it is just a jab and doesn't mean anything, because we are aiming to use facts and logic. The emotional response does not care. Facts do not care about your feelings. So, in the conclusion of the article, Boyce concludes, quote, as much as 3% to 5% of all cancers might be attributable to all sources of radiation, including medical, occupational, and environmental exposures. Large radiation doses cause cancer, but we may never know whether small doses on the order of natural background radiation do so. Nonetheless, it is prudent to assume that there is no threshold below which radiation would fail to cause some deleterious effect, and models must be applied to estimate hazards at low doses. In this regard, the study of Japanese atomic bomb survivors has generated an extensive body of data and continues to provide the framework by which we understand the effects of radiation and judge the potential risks from low-level exposures, unquote. This was an editorial for a reason. It is not a full-fledged study like Cube would have you believe. No experiment was done, and these editorials are extremely common in the scientific community, especially on fringe issues people think need attention. This does not disprove that radiation exists. It is an editorial that is unsure of what low doses of radiation would do to people. Multiple times in the article, he says that high doses of radiation can be lethal or will just cause cancer outright. And listing this has brought Cube's point even lower through his own evidence. But who am I to try and disprove the personal account of someone? The author, Cube, took a personal trip to Hiroshima and Nagasaki with a Geiger counter that they bought after Fukushima, another hoax if you would believe Cube, and they brought a Geiger counter and said, well, I have not found any radiation, and there's people living here, like look at this massive city, how could people build on this irradiated wasteland? This is Cube falling for the propaganda again. That is not how radiation works. These bombs have detonated over 80 years ago. When Cube went, Cube would have found nothing more than background radiation. This is due to multiple reasons, including the half-life of radioactive materials, but due to the mushroom-like effect of the cloud and how the air currents will launch these radioactive particles into the stratosphere, they would have been dispersed by the wind after being shot over 45,000 feet into the air. It is completely plausible, if not assumedly guaranteed, that Cube would find nothing because of how radioactive material is distributed in an atom blast, especially because Little Boy and Fat Man were both air detonation bombs. The fact that these detonated in the air usually about 500 to 1,000 feet above the city, would mean that Seversky looking for a bald spot, quote unquote, would be impossible, because the effects of the blast would have tapered off the farther it gets from the epicenter. I feel that's common knowledge. And the lack of devastation is not only disappointing to Seversky, but also the air detonation of this blast would explain why a lot of these delicacies were left in place and why not everything was completely annihilated, because it had 600-ish feet to go before any of the devastation of the pressure wave would have reached the ground. Now, I'm going to push back the Hollywood effects claim, because that's a surprise tool that will help us later. Well, I want to address the nuclear terrorism claim. I want to say there have been multiple groups and individuals who have tried multiple times to acquire nuclear capabilities, but I'm going to make it easy for you, and I'm going to sum up why none of them ever succeed. And it comes down to the majority of 3 reasons. 1, groups want to act too fast and they want immediate results. Therefore, they can't get everything together to steal a nuclear weapon, or second of all, cannot produce any of the required materials in time for whatever they want to do. Secondly, is the exact opposite problem. They wait too long to accumulate everything important or plan out their theft, and they can't do it quietly enough. And this leads to them either being a known threat that gets infiltrated by federal agents and disbanded, or just simply falling apart due to suspicion. Or 3, they can't get the conditions right, because if you're not just stealing an atomic bomb, which I would say is harder than Nicolas Cage's stealing of the Declaration of Independence, if you just want to do the refinement yourself and cut out the middleman, this requires extremely precise equipment as well as highly specialized equipment, rather than just anything you can find in your backyard, mainly due to the heavy regulation of fissile material and the machines themselves. They are so highly regulated that you would need multiple people at every level of power and security clearance to keep quiet to make it ever work. And considering what we've seen recently about what people will do when people have weapons of mass destruction or fissile uranium, quote unquote, it makes sense why nuclear terrorism has never been successful. It has been tried many, many times, but as for something else that has been tried many, many times, it has never worked, or at least in the way that it was theorized to work. But he wants to then say, oh, I was skimming the internet and I found this guy called Anders Bjorkman, but I'm going to leave this one as engagement bait. Yes, even in this bunker here, I still have numbers to meet. So if you want me to cover Anders Bjorkman, and who I would argue is the Gene Ray to whatever Cube is, Anders Bjorkman is the man who's actually put in the effort, the research, the big beefy arguments. Cube is just a tiny little acolyte, a follower. So if you want me to try and win 1 million euros by proving him wrong, please leave a comment letting me know to do so. And that's probably going to be the next series, because Francis C. Deck's going to be wrapping up soon, and I really don't want to, but that's a whole nother thing. I want to win 1 million euros. So I will make a series proving it wrong and send it to him. Whether he will accept it, I am really hesitant to say he will, but who cares? It'll be a fun exercise. Maybe I will just win 1 million euros anyway, despite not being European nor owning a single euro at all. But back to the actually tackleable claims within the scope of this video. He will list a quote by Nikola Tesla. Now, we all know Tesla's a genius. We all know Tesla was someone who was stifled by the scientific community as a whole. Now, the next thing to say is that can be mutually exclusive with him being wrong on some things, because this is a textbook example of piggybacking off of Tesla's credibility and genius with electricity to something that he is not even qualified or even educated enough to speak on. Tesla believed in something called the structured atom, which is not the most accurate atomic model we have today, which is a few key elaborations on the Bohr model, the 99% empty space one. The structured atomic model takes to heart the structured part by emphasizing that the atom is all nucleus with no charge, that is held together by a proton neutron-electron pairing. There are no neutrons. And from what I can find, because apparently there are still people who believe in this, and they have a website and a book, and I'm not going to buy their book, so from what I can find from their website, it's that everything is structured. And the efforts of Bohr, the 99% empty space, and other atomic models are discarded. Now, Bohr's experiment of proving the nucleus with charge around it, as well as J.J. Thomson proving the charge, prove that Tesla and his ideas are false. And in this quote, even if you believe that Tesla's experiments were legitimate enough, and even if he was ability to read if energy was produced before 1931, it's still believable enough that Tesla would not have the equipment to measure energy read, as well as one atom being broken is not like the SpongeBob gag where Plankton goes atom by atom and then it blows up. It's not like that. If you take Tesla's claims that he has smashed atoms multiple times without any of the modern requirements that we know are required to shatter atoms like a Large Hadron Collider, he is simply not technologically advanced enough and outside of his field enough that he is completely uneducated to speak on this matter. But Tesla did his own research. Well, Einstein was also contemporary, and Einstein and his ilk were able to produce a weapon that harnessed the atom, as well as basing the entirety of what we know about modern physics on their theories. So, take from that what you will. If this were Tesla using his 15 million volts of electricity to do something else fantastic, I would believe him, because he is an expert on electricity and has spent his entire life studying electricity and its movements. I would not take his opinion seriously on something that he has tertiarily experimented with and gets into beefs in which he cannot back up his opinions coherently with someone who is the foundation of modern physics. The last part of this document is tackling the claims of a man named Galen Winsor. Now, this is another guy that I would kind of just expect would have like one article on him and then nothing else, but he's apparently a prolific person. Not that he is educated, because he only had a degree in chemistry, and he mainly worked in nuclear sites which specialized in refining. Now, the reason why I say he is not educated enough is because people love to exaggerate his credentials, and I feel that giving this man enough credit to exaggerate his credentials is false, because he's an outspoken critic of radiation. This is another one of the radiation doesn't exist, or we shouldn't stress so much about radiation, and he's quoted multiple times trying to get people to calm down about the effects of nuclear really anything. He made some ridiculous quote about how, oh, by US federal regulations, I'm going to have to be buried 2,000 feet underground. And two of his most famous stunts are eating uranium at lectures, both in print and on film, and swimming in the pools of reactor cores. So let's look at them one at a time. As I said, there are multiple attested reporting times in print and on tape of Windsor eating what he claims to be uranium. However, a lot of these print articles cite this as uranium oxide. Now, what's the difference? This is not enriched uranium, first of all. Second of all, this is not even refined uranium. Third of all, this is what happens when uranium rusts, because uranium is a metal. This would be the equivalent of a high fae eating rust to prove that they shouldn't be afraid of pure iron. He's effectively eating what is just uranium rust, which, in a quote from federal agents talking about him, they say, quote, "Windsor's activities are troubling, but technically still quite legal," said Nancy Kerner, supervisor of the Waste Management Unit of the Radiation Control Section of the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services. "Since the uranium Windsor eats is insoluble and probably, quote, exposes his guts to a few millirim, it's probably not that bad," unquote, Kerner said, "but it is irresponsible," unquote, unquote. Now, thus, it's no different than if he were just eating rust on camera to prove that you shouldn't be afraid of radiation. He's not standing in front of reactors, he's not eating enriched uranium, he's performing a stunt to enforce his point. Now, as for the swimming in the cooling pools, from the research that I did, it is literally no different than any other swimming pool unless you are trying to kidnap the reactor core. The only time the radiation would ever be dangerous is if you dove near the rods, as the formula for calculating radiation exposure cuts radiation in half for every 7 centimeters that it travels in water. Thus, it would diffuse to a point of nothing because you have about 30 feet of water between you and the reactor core. I read this humorous Tumblr post one time, and I think I'm just going to read the end of it because I actually managed to find the article that it's sourced from in my research. And I think it's a funny way to end this off, as to why Gellin Windsor is a fraud in both of his claims, and as to why he doesn't know what he's talking about. The article and post ends, quote, "So as far as swimming safety goes, the bottom line is you're probably okay as long as you don't dive to the bottom or pick up anything strange. But just to be sure, I got in touch with a friend of mine who works at a research reactor. I asked him what he thought would happen if you tried to swim in their radiation containment pool. In our reactor? He thought about it for a moment. You die pretty quickly before reaching the water from gunshot wounds." End quote. Which I think is a pretty apt way to say it. Now, you might ask why I haven't undone your bonds or asked you to make a choice yet. Well, that's because I've been lying to you to some degree. Now, this lie is not something big, not something that you'd be mad at me for, I hope. But that's because, in this first part, I was covering this document that I had scraped from everyone's favorite site, Reddit. Not that I'm a Redditor or use it frequently, I just also wanted to point out that this was the only centralized place that was actually tackleable and not whatever Bjorkman was schizo posting on his own website that's like 9 pages long, written in time cube style, super long pages. Even our conspiracy didn't want this guy. That is how much this post was BTFO'd. Now, as I've already said, this post was posted by an account by a now suspended user called Arc of the Cube, linked to what I presume is their YouTube channel, Piercing the Cube, because they both have cube in the name, and their profile picture is the same green, red, white cube style thing. And as of this moment, I have less subscribers than Cube, so I'm punching up. This is all sanctioned. I'm not punching down. I'm not using my power to oppress the small. And on this channel was uploaded a video called The Nuclear Hoax, challenging the narrative, which unfortunately has more views than anything on my entire channel, so maybe I should just start proliferating conspiracy theories if I ever get bored. But it is also displayed prominently at the top of the post. It also aligns with around the time the post was made, because it doesn't give me the exact time it was made. It says 2 years ago, and this was posted in April 2024, so I'm going to assume it's just a clean 2 years ago and it's the same guy. Besides, they're both called Cube, so I can just use Cube interchangeably, and I will be correct for both parts of this video. The second half will be a dedicated takedown to select parts of the video, because I'm not going to do any of that React channel nonsense. I don't want it to just be, yes, me staring at the screen. I'm at least going to cut it up a little bit. Now, this is obviously going to open me up to criticism. I'm taking it out of context, I'm cherry picking, but remember, facts don't care about your feelings. I'm going to leave the video in the description. If you ever want to watch it yourself, if you ever think I'm being uncharitable or taking anything out of context for the benefit of my argument, I want you to watch the video yourself and compare. I'm going to be making Cube sound a lot more credible than he actually sounds in the entirety of his video, so you'll at least have the context. But with that out of the way, I actually have to set this up. I hope it still works. Okay, it does. I'm just gonna let that play in the background while we get to the part that I want to, because I'm going to sum up his intro, because he has a bad habit of putting in what I would feel are unrelated things or jabs, but he puts it in, and it's his channel, so I'm not gonna critique him on that. I'm just gonna sum up the intro so we can get to the actual substantive parts of the argument. Doesn't make many waves, I mainly just find it pretty cringe. Mainly just, it establishes the topics that he will cover in the video, enumerated in the chapters in the description, which the chapters are: Do Nukes Exist?, The Military-Industrial Complex, The Witness, The Jesuit Priest, The Night Before, The Problem, and Nagasaki. Now, let's start with the chapter, Do Nuclear Bombs Exist?
Do nuclear bombs exist? Your immediate answer is yes. But how do you know? During the mid-20th century, television and movie watchers were bombarded with imagery of what was purported to be atomic test footage. But what were they really watching? They couldn't rewind a videotape or rescan through a video on their computer. So what option did they have but to accept these images at their face value? Now we have opportunity to scrutinize these images to see if they hold up to analysis.
Okay, we're going to scrutinize these images and see if they hold up to analysis. That's good. Let's see what proof he brings to the table.
Take a look at these trees. Now what was that? And who turned the camera? They're in awfully straight lines, aren't they? Now this must be a different blast because it's coming from a different direction Wait, now they've put it back. But those are the same trees we saw in the first clip, aren't they? And now this. First they showed us these trees that they panned left on. Then they show us these trees that look like they should be next to a model train. Notice how straight the rows are. It looks artificial to me. Then they show us these trees again. Where's the forward camera? And then back to these trees again. And then they show us what looks to be a real forest that's been chopped down or torn down.
No, that can't be it. That can't just be it. Please tell me that's not it. No, there's no way it's going to be him just pointing at nuclear footage and saying it's fake. Oh, I see. It's coming from the all feds are Satan worshippers angle.
They worship the sun after all, Lucifer.
Oh, okay. I'm invoking the Razor on this one. Just to be clear, I'm going to shift Cube's video out to some high-quality nuclear test footage in the background. So if I ever get a response, which I don't expect to because his last upload was 6 months ago, I can at least debate over high-quality footage rather than this nonsense that you can see this 240p Russian original test footage from. Okay, so I want to save this actual debunking this bit for the end of the section, but I got my laughs out. We can continue to the next segment of the video.
And who headed up the whole program? None other than J. Robert Oppenheimer of the Oppenheimer family, who is reputed to have been the original financiers who got the Rothschilds started in Frankfurt, Germany in the 18th century.
I'm gonna be honest with you. I love Cube's speech patterns because it will be some of the okay, I can see where you're coming from. And then he'll insert something like this, where this isn't even concerning J. Robert Oppenheimer. He's talking about the ancestral line back to Samuel Oppenheimer in the late 1600s, who collaborated with the Rothschilds to form their ancestral banking firm, making this probably the most ancestral tier well poisoning that I have ever seen. Not even to mention, how does J. Robert Oppenheimer, being even remotely affiliated with the Rothschilds, matter to the existence of nuclear bombs? I understand it's supposed to be, oh yes, he's connected to the Rothschilds, and the Rothschilds are obviously connected to everything because they have a banking dynasty that nearly everyone is involved with. However, even if you take that as true, that doesn't support your point at all. It's just well poisoning J. Robert Oppenheimer, and it's not even taking away any of his achievements. It doesn't disprove that the Manhattan Project existed. Okay, the Manhattan Project was funded by the Rothschilds for propaganda purposes. Okay, this is just a fringe argument. It's not debating any of the science. This is just ancestrally well poisoning the scientist at the head of the Manhattan Project. It doesn't prove anything substantial. But anyway, let's proceed.
You're thinking, what about Hiroshima? Is that Hiroshima? Is that Hiroshima? That looks like Hiroshima, but it looks like it's been carpet bombed. Check out this image of Rotterdam. Was that a nuclear bomb? Now compare it to this image of Hiroshima. Actually, this isn't Hiroshima. It's Tokyo after firebombing in 1945.
Okay, hold on. Pointing to things and saying, is that Hiroshima? Is that Hiroshima? What about this? What about this? I want to take on, again, more concretely this time, the fantasy and propaganda that Cube is falling for, that nuclear weapons will just vaporize everything that they come into contact with. It is a misconception that a lot of people have, especially around the first testings of nuclear weapons. Little Boy and Fat Man had about a 2% fission rate. This makes it difficult to estimate the tonnage of the actual bombs because you see a lot of numbers thrown around, with the absolute lowest end being 5 kilotons, but the more accurately predicted by observations and experiments by Penny, Serber, and Reynolds after the bombs had gone off. These estimations are just that, estimations, because we will never know how much of a fission rate that the bomb had. It had a potential to go up to 20,000, but it's highly unlikely that it ever reached that point because these bombs were so inefficient. I want to say why this entire thing is not just Hollywood effects and actually transpired the way that the historical narrative says it did. I do want to point out during this phase, though, that the destruction is more complete on carpet bombing because carpet bombings experienced multiple retreads of bombs, you know, making the rocks bounce multiple times. Rotterdam is annihilated because it was bombed to ash and experienced a large prolonged siege of the city. Tokyo, after being relentlessly firebombed, would look about the same because it is the fire that does the majority of the damage. These high explosives are meant to destroy the concrete buildings. The rest is swept away by napalm. The reason why the nuclear bomb is believable at Hiroshima, if not statistically the most likely option, rather than what Cube will prostrate later in the video, I'm going to save for later. Because now I want to save my massive come together moment for a big reveal at the end. So I hope you'll bear with me for all these pins I'm asking you to put in things, but I want to address a claim that he's kind of gotten to already before he actually gets to it. A lot of people love to ask, and I myself had to ask this when I watched the video for the first time, is how do you film a nuclear explosion? Now, that's a really good question, because even I didn't know the answer when I was going into this video. I watched this just shocked in awe, but thanks to the US government's efforts to declassify a lot of its Cold War and World War II documents, they have declassified a document about Project 9.1, which shows how cool the cameras that shot this footage actually are, as I will lovingly source from a federal agency. Quote, Project 9.1 provided a centralized organization responsible for all technical motion pictures and still photography required by the various military effects projects in Operation Upshot Knothole. Technical motion picture photography was employed to record on film the effects of blast and thermal radiation from shots 9 and 10 on various test objects. In addition, the shock front itself was photographed on shots 1, 4, 9, 10, and 11. All zero-time technical photography was done from individual photo stations, generally steel towers, which were located at distances between 1,150 and 15,000 feet from intended ground zero. Shot 9 was covered by 193 cameras of various types, ranging in speed from 2 frames per minute to 2,500 frames per second. To support these cameras, 100 towers between 6 and 25 feet high were used. Shot 10, although covered on a smaller scale, utilized 94 cameras on 50 towers. Shots 1, 4, and 11 were covered by 4 cameras mounted in photo trailers. Results of the photography were quite successful. The photographic hazards accompanying a nuclear detonation, namely dust, thermal, and nuclear radiation, blast, and rapidly changing illumination, were all satisfactorily overcome at distances from ground zero greater than 2,500 feet. At closer distances, results were quite unsatisfactory as had been predicted. In general, it is possible to conclude that photographic instrumentation is feasible within certain limitations. It is recommended that any future tests of this nature, a quote-unquote camera line be established and a stabilization provided in one continuous strip. In planning for a future test, it would be advisable to consider using the methods and equipment developed for this test, unquote. Now, what is this report saying? Well, it's saying that they had set up a litany of different cameras at a different radius from the blast, as well as different frames per second, different heights of steel towers, different everything. This is one big experiment, and the footage we do have is an example of supreme survivorship bias, saying that this is the only footage we have. Oh, who's holding the camera? Why do we have these if they're allegedly from the nuclear blast? Well, it's because we don't have the shots that didn't make it, right? That's the classic survivorship graph. We're looking at the red dots and we don't see the not red dot areas because those ones drones didn't come back. Saying things like, who's holding the camera? These are autonomous cameras. They do not need to be held. They are set up beforehand. They run a constant thing. Oh, the footage is cut for Hollywood-style effects. Yes, because it is meant to demonstrate the power of the nuclear bomb. It is not meant to make you believe that they exist. It is to demonstrate their power. It is the same as any other engaging form of media that uses cuts. I cut my audio all the time. Does that mean that I'm a federal agent secretly ranting about David Koresh using FBI-approved sources? Well, both can be true. By the way, I make no moral judgment on David Koresh. I just wanted to give him a biography, but whatever, that's outside the scope of this. And do you care if you're really strapped to this chair? I bet you just want to go home, so I won't bore you about it. All of the things that Cube says are for propagandistic purposes. Yes, that is important. Whenever Cube says this is exaggerated, yes, it's correct, because you need it to be emphasized for the propaganda war. Going into this, you had the other major superpower on the other side of the globe that you had to base your entire global strategy around, and they need to believe that it is as powerful as you market it as. Oh, but Bjorkman said, wait, that's a lie, but, well, then put your comment down below, and then maybe I'll cover Bjorkman, huh? But anyway, all of the things he says are not arguing the central point of the science. These are merely, these were all put out by the US government for propaganda purposes. Yeah, everything during that time was out for propaganda purposes. Everything put out by the government, even now, most likely, is for propaganda purposes. We have the luxury of historical hindsight to look back and see that these are propagandistic videos, showing that the nuclear weapon is either as powerful or more powerful than people think it is. And Cube falls into this, because a lot of his arguments rely on, everything wasn't completely annihilated, which is exactly what the propaganda is. He's falling into Seversky's opinions, where he's seeing that these things are not the way that he expects them to be, and then forming his opinions off of that. So, let's see what his next rational, completely, totally logical argument will be.
If you accept that FDR might have had foreknowledge of the bombing at Pearl Harbor, maybe you might want to leave room for the possibility that his propaganda machine might have created the myth of atomic bombs.
No, you were so close! It's not the fact that FDR had foreknowledge of Pearl Harbor, although I do want to look into that at a future point, because there actually is a lot more than I thought there would be onto it. I'm not saying it's true, I'm just saying that I would be interested to cover it in the future. But saying that then he would create a fake nuclear bomb is completely out there. You are not debating the evidence. This is debating whether FDR would just fabricate this entire thing as if FDR, being one piece of the entire US federal government machine, would have the insane amount of power to do this one thing. Not even the fact that he will take indirect jabs at Truman, so I know he's not a big fan of Truman either, or I'm getting ahead of myself. But yes, these are all propaganda shots for the purpose of the Soviet Union and strengthening the United States' position in the Cold War. The United States was able to take such unprecedented action in the 4 years before the Soviets got the bomb because everyone believed it was this soul-annihilating weapon. It's not that FDR's propaganda machine faked it, it's that FDR's propaganda machine wanted you to believe it so you would listen to what the United States said when they postured and saber-rattled with it. But let's continue.
Anyways, I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. If you're hell-bent on believing that they can blow up the world at the push of a button, then go ahead. But next time you hear a politician justifying the invasion of a country based on the fact that they supposedly have weapons of mass destruction, realize that they're not only lying about the other country supposedly possessing weapons of mass destruction, they also may be lying about the very existence of weapons of mass destruction. And why don't they call them nuclear bombs anymore?
Okay, I will admit Cube has one thing correct. Can we all take a moment to say that the Iraq War was bad? Okay, I'm glad we've had that moment now. Once again, I would elaborate that this is a massive leap in logic. Yes, you can lie about weapons of mass destruction as a justifier for military action. We've seen that super recently and multiple times throughout the 2000s. That is pretty bad. Lying about their existence as a whole for other means of control, I think, is a lot less feasible based on things I've already said. Oh, by the way, the next clip is going to lead with a website called nuclearlies.com. It's a null domain. I can't go into anything about it because it no longer exists. So I guess this is the only piece of nuclearlies.com that gets to be preserved through this 2-year-old YouTube video. So let's see what Nuclear Lies has to contribute to the argument.
The military-industrial complex finds it convenient to perpetuate the myth of nuclear weapons to exploit the American people. Nuclear bombs do not exist. Think about it. Eisenhower warned the American citizens of the military-industrial complex. They have ransacked the people of trillions of dollars while the education system degenerates.
Okay, yes. I have already stated and done a video about the military-industrial complex, and I want to side with Smedley Butler on this one, that, yes, can we all take a moment to say military-industrial complex bad? Okay, now that we've had time to say it, I can kind of see where it's coming from now. Nuclear weapons are a justifier to strip people of millions of dollars. Now, I will say, stripping people of millions of dollars bad. Wow, I'm so brave. I'm taking so many brave stances in this bunker of my own creation. But what I will also then follow up, like, at what point is it too much effort and too much money to perpetuate the lie rather than just say, yes, they do exist? Do you have to jump through all the hoops to say that it's not real, or you could just walk and say, yes, it is real, and it is being used to strip people of millions of dollars? Both can be true. This isn't nukes have to be fake and people are being stripped of millions of dollars. It can also be people are being stripped of millions of dollars and nukes are real. It just really depends. What do you want to confirm your bias with? Remember, facts don't care about your feelings. That's what we're on. Both can be true, so mounting this as a justifier that it is true is a fallacy. So, let's see what other completely rational arguments that these people are going to make.
As far as nuclear energy, why hasn't it replaced oil? It's a fishy story. People shrug off the reasons why this might be. What about nuclear testing? The military-industrial marketplace sneakily used high-tech dynamite and flash bombs dropped from high altitude. That's the reason for the mysterious white trails near nearly every so-called nuke test explosion.
Now, why hasn't nuclear power replaced oil? Well, I think the one major reason is because it's gotten such a bad rap from events like Chernobyl and Fukushima, which I will point out again, Cube denies in his original post ever happened. And it's simply the rational people don't want to live near things that they think are unreliable and will just remove them from the census if it goes wrong. That's not something that you'd want to do. People still have this stigma that nuclear power isn't safe based on a 60-year-old event that happened in a country that didn't really care about its nuclear regulation like we do now. We are still trying to replace oil. It is just the most convenient form of fuel and the most reliable. Until any source of energy can overcome the stigma associated or overcome oil in efficiency and reliability, it will be the go-to fuel, which, once again, oil can be the go-to fuel without having nuclear replace it. Nuclear doesn't have to replace it to prove that it's real. Both can be true. Facts do not care about your feelings. Also, I wanted to address the, why are the little white lines coming up and it's just flash bombs, which I included at the end of the clip, is these are actually super cool. These are naval ordnance rockets, or NORs, that are placed to help cameras identify how the pressure wave moves. Because when a nuke goes off, it generates a giant pressure wave that moves faster than the fireball, which is hard to measure on tape. So they developed rockets that when they sense a disturbance will shoot up into the air, which is why you get those little white trails. Roll the next clip. Let's see what we got.
We haven't unloaded nuclear or atomic bombs in 70 years. Are we that rational? Or is the illusion of nuclear arms a way to cash in through taxation like the fake moon landings?
What?
Okay, I think that one was a miss. Let's see what Cube's alternative idea might be. Also, in case you're upset that I didn't debunk this claim that I don't think needs debunking, both can be true. You can still be exploitative through taxation and still land on the moon or not land on the moon. But let's see what Cube's alternative theory to what might have happened would be, because that is what this is building up to. How will you disprove this mountain of evidence against you? I will give you the floor.
If the H.G. Wells atomic bombs didn't exist, then what destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Let's take a look at the aftermath. Is this Hiroshima? Is this Hiroshima? Is this Hiroshima? What's the difference again between an H.G. Wells atomic bomb and a traditional firebombing again? When we say firebombed or carpet bombed, we mean the land was pelted with M47s and M69s. An M47 is a 100-pound oil gel bomb. Each B-29 bomber carried 182 of them. An M69 is a 6-pound gelled gasoline bomb, 1,520 per aircraft. Also, some B-29s carried high explosives to deter Japanese firefighters. It's easier to count the major cities the United States didn't bomb. 1. Kyoto. Why did the Zionist-controlled United States government spend $2 billion in 1942 money on these very expensive H.G. Wells atomic bombs if carpet bombing worked just fine? Why, to scare the world population and rule us by fear, of course.
Of course, of course. See, this is, you know, when I talk about the conspiracy theory black hole, the one where you have to tread the event horizon of believability for it to be cool, I think this one just falls in without even thinking twice. And I am going to now stray away from Cube's video. Before I answer Cube's question, I want to sum up the rest of his video. And if you think I'm leaving anything out, if you think there is super core information that I missed, feel free to yell at me or go watch the video yourself. But I feel I have done a proper job in addressing everything that Cube has or will bring up. The next section is called The Witness, which mainly retreads what we already know about Seversky. He adds a little bit more to the quote, but I don't think it changes the majority of the point that I made in the response covering the original post. I would also like to point out that this section leads with a US propaganda reel at the beginning of the segment featuring Seversky, and I would also like to remind you that if you've forgotten, Seversky was deeply connected with the US government, even having people like Disney and Truman and LeMay take his advice about his strategic bombing campaigns. I would just want to point out the double standard that will continue to be used, and how when people close to the US government favor his position, he'll gladly accept any tiny scraps of so-called evidence to support his point. I want to answer the question that Cube asks. Why would the United States spend $2 billion in 1945 money to construct the atom bomb? Multiple reasons. Besides just global control of the world population, which I doubt the United States can even achieve now with all of its resources. Or maybe I'm just blind to the conspiracy. But the more outward you go, the larger this pressure wave goes, the more devastation and evidence you have to sift through. And when you just say it's global control, well, okay, anyone can say that. I can say that the fact that I had to run around the DMV for a week because they wouldn't give me the proper forms to do what I needed to do within a strict time frame that they set for myself is tyrannical and evidence that the United States controls every single DMV and they want to control me, obviously. Everyone is controlled by a government to some degree, but the United States being able to achieve global control, they missed their window. They had exaggerated the power of the nuclear weapon to such a degree that if they wanted to, they could have subjugated the world in that time when the Soviets didn't have the bomb, but they didn't. The Soviets then achieved the bomb, and we have now what is called the Cold War. The reason why they wanted to spend these $2 billion in the first place was because they were afraid that the Germans would achieve this technology first. Another thing surprisingly left out of Cube's analysis is that He doesn't talk anything about heavy water. He doesn't base his evidence on what the Germans were trying to use in 1945 or before. It's just a flat-out denial because I don't like the United States. I need to construct a narrative as to why they are so successful. It's just like tankies on Twitter. It's nothing more than an idea to project the idea that America is bad. You can say that America is bad all you want. Both can be true. America can be bad, and America can be a nuclear-armed power. Just because all the, in this idea, quote-unquote nuclear-armed nations are just part of one big conspiracy, that gets harder and harder to believe that there wouldn't be a whistleblower or anyone that would have seen anything to counteract this massive conspiracy that consumes the globe. But remember when I said all those pins you can put aside because he explained firebombing, right? So I'm going to put the plug, metaphorically, into this massive nuclear weapon that I have been constructing throughout this video. I want to say the simple thing: nukes start fires. Let me walk you through the 3 phases of a nuclear blast. You have the pressure wave, the fire, and then the radiation left afterward. The blast is simple enough. It generates a massive pressure wave that rapidly expands from the progenitor point of the blast. And for Little Boy, this is specifically about 5 psi, which for the uninitiated is enough to level anything but earthquake-resistant structures, which we discussed Japan would have these because they started building them in 1923 after the Great Kanto earthquake in all of their major urban centers. If it were a pressure wave of 10 psi, or the blast had been closer to them, it would have annihilated them as it was said. But I will explain in a second why that is not true. Next is the fire. The fireball at Hiroshima was about 1,200 meters in diameter, and it ran a temperature close to the surface of the sun, about 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Yes, I know I'm mixing measurement systems. You can be mad at me now. Now, nuclear fires aren't your average fire with a concrete starting point. They are a conflagration of factors, to use the firestorm term. After the pressure wave, air wants to rush back into a place where it was expelled by the pressure wave, and either the direct heat from the fireball itself or any other disrupted sources of heat like stoves or radiators or candles or any other previous sources of fire like you tipped over the furnace now have a bunch of newly generated fuel to start their fires. Eyewitness reports state the fires are almost ephemeral, starting as if they had almost missed their cue on a stage play, or started as if they had forgot to start. Now, we need to talk about what a firestorm is, because when there are many sources of fire, no matter how small, with lots of fuel, it is very easy and possible for it to combine into what is called a firestorm, which is a self-feeding natural disaster equivalent, because it's not natural, but it can occur naturally. The firestorm, for our purposes, even though it's created artificially, I will call it a natural disaster, being able to produce its own soot-black rain, and sometimes even lightning inside the pyrostatic clouds. These firestorms were observed throughout the incendiary campaign over Japan, and were considered to be insanely random. Sometimes a bombing run would go like normal, they'd burn down a quarter of a city, but very rarely they could conflagrate into a firestorm and cause massive amounts of casualties. Now, when the nukes were dropped, they produced a firestorm 100% of the time. These were basically guaranteed to produce enough fuel and enough fires to conflagrate into a firestorm. And it is hypothesized that the reason why we don't have as many, if you want to use the very cold term, test subjects and very warm term survivors is because a lot of the people who would have succumbed to the radiation to begin with would succumb to the fire to begin with, if not the initial pressure blast. Lastly, the radiation. Since both Little Boy and Fat Man burst above the air, the fission products are shot into the stratosphere with very little local fallout on the ground. However, the blast itself, besides producing a pressure wave, also produces a neutron burst in a radius of about a mile for Little Boy and Fat Man, where anyone hit by this burst would succumb to radiation poisoning in a matter of a few days, or outside this radius would suffer from an increased cancer risk. And once again, I am going to point out that if we are to believe the alternative firebombing campaign story that Cube will set up throughout the remainder of this video that I'm going to skip over, because even if people were rerouted from their original bombing campaigns, even if these people were carrying enough napalm and bombs to annihilate Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they theoretically had enough time to make these runs, and possibly the pilot of the plane said something wrong, you're not debating the essence of the argument. This requires an astronomical amount of black space and historical questioning that simply was never put together for all of these events to make sense. Yes, okay, we'll listen to Seversky, but we'll ignore every other observer's report, including the people who estimated the tonnage of the blast being Penny, Serber, and Reynolds. Ignore all of the victim statements about how people tried to cope after the blast, how they saw this flash, how people couldn't save their families, how these fires sprung up out of nowhere, and argue over all the grainy footage you want. The substance of the argument isn't there. You can talk about how Crawford Sams was ordered to exaggerate the power of the A-bomb by Truman, and rely on that exact propagandistic interpretation for your interpretation to make any sort of sense. You can talk about the Jesuit priest who clearly doesn't speak English and is struggling to speak it exactly the same as the Harley guy from people who would assert 9/11 was an inside job. This Jesuit priest pausing and trying to comprehend a language that is clearly not his, him being clearly German, is not evidence enough to prove that an entire weapon system and source of power does not exist. This is not a scientific argument. This is not a fact-based argument. It relies on questioning a very select piece of evidence in an extremely controlled environment. Any introduction of new information blows this argument to powder. The reason why Hiroshima and Nagasaki are so debated is because they are the one example of concrete proof that nuclear weapons were ever used. You can say they were highly coordinated firebombing campaigns, and if we accept that that's true, just to humor the argument, everything that Cube says, and if we also say that everything else that Cube says is true, this doesn't somehow negate all of the other nuclear examples throughout history. Just because you go with a Geiger counter to the places of these and find no radiation is not concrete proof. There are still people cleaning up Chernobyl. There are still people cleaning up Fukushima. Oh, he already said that one was fake. But still, he doesn't even address Chernobyl, or those tragedies, or the people that go to clean up the radiation, or any of the Broken Arrow incidents, or any of the nuclear incidents involving radiation in nuclear power plants. Some of the most clickbaited videos on YouTube are people who have gone through the horrifying effects of radiation poisoning, and he doesn't even try and address that nuclear power even exists at all, as if disproving the nuclear bombs themselves would disprove nuclear power or radiation as a whole. Both can be true, even if you want to say that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are just elaborate firebombing campaigns, despite being extremely insensitive. But remember, facts don't care about your feelings. It is a sense of both can be true, because you haven't taken the effort to disprove any of the scientific arguments around nuclear power as a whole, besides just saying the entire thing is fake, which you can do to anything. It does not nullify any of what has been presented in the historical timeline. It doesn't nullify any of the other accounts by numerous people who had no stake in a global conspiracy, unless you do also want to rope in the random Japanese civilians and say that these are all crisis actors controlled by the money of the Zionist-occupied government of the United States connected to the Rothschilds, which I think is an even larger stretch than anything else that Cube has asserted, and I don't want to put words into his mouth. If he wants to continue to debate the edges and the fringe of the argument and put questions into things that, despite Google searching one thing, which is what I did whenever I had a question, I conducted one Google search and found enough information to easily disprove literally anything in this video, I'm starting to believe that Cube's research just accounts to a large amount of confirmation bias. Even the cameras the cameras I found myself questioning in this video, and I googled it and I found a legitimately cool answer. I didn't find two crackpots running around propagating things that are just scientifically impossible because the science was never debated. He just quoted Tesla because he agreed with him, and Tesla wasn't even right. There's no debate about the science because he would get blown out of the water, and second of all, I would believe that's not his battle to fight. I feel that he's content to leave that to Anders Bjorkman. It's hoping to poke enough holes in the narrative that you might be persuaded to do your own research, and the fruits of that research would be to confirm his bias and your bias by constructing your own house of toothpicks. I did my own research and found that Cube is just grossly misinformed, and if you want to see me do a whole series on Bjorkman, just ask and I'll do it. Now, I will ask you the question that I had asked at the beginning. With all this facts and logic, with all of the facts don't care about your feelings, I encourage you to prove me wrong and press the button. I'm glad you didn't press it. That would have been a lot of problems for everyone, but I'm glad you managed to finally come around. Now, before I go outside and face the music, I would like to ask you something. If you made it this far, I'm very happy you did, and I would like you and encourage you, because if you made it this far, it obviously shows you like my content. I would encourage you to like, comment, and subscribe, because that's what people who like people's content do. Even if you were watching it on something else, even if you were playing Borderlands in the background, I know that's what I did in 2016, flick on some old 2016 commentary videos, play Borderlands. I would still encourage you to like, comment, and subscribe. This video took me a long time and an extraordinary amount of effort and research. Please support me. I'm not asking you for money, I'm just asking you to satisfy my ego. And just looking at my checklist of 2016 YouTube commentary tropes, I think I covered them all. I even had the little character breaks in ad hominem every once in a while. So I just want to give you a deep thank you. And I hope you can now see that there is no escape from the brutality of reality.